All right, welcome everyone. This is Parkour History with Max Henry. Really excited to bring this episodic series to you guys. It's sort of the purpose behind it is to have a consolidated space where you can go really deep into the history of parkour, examine what's important, and also understand why it's important. So after giving you, there's a lot of threads that tie into this story. So we're going to start as far back as we feel like is reasonable to go. And we're going to pull from many different sources and storylines across the whole series. But ultimately, we're going to hopefully tie them all together for you and give you some context. At the end of every episode, we'll kind of relate what's this story that we cover in each episode mean in the modern day. And I'm real pumped to introduce Max. If you already don't know, he is an epic parkour historian and the only person maybe that can do this job effectively of creating piece, or that's a little bit of an exaggeration maybe. It isn't though.
I appreciate it.
It isn't though. It isn't really an exaggeration, because here's the thing, the information's been out there, but again, like, you've had to piece it together always before. Hopefully this series will solve that problem where you won't have to piece all these things together. There's books, there's various videos and interviews that if you do a lot of hunting, you can find the stories, but Max has done all that for you. And that's where we get to start today.
Yeah, like any good media host, I just want to spoon feed you my narrative so you don't have to do your own research. That's my goal here. No, I really appreciate that. I think you hit the nail on the head. Today's episode, the first part of our Georges Hébert segment, is a really good example of information that a lot of folks will probably be familiar with, but maybe not in quite as much detail, and particularly in the second segment on Georges Hébert's life. And it's something that I just really enjoy nerding out on, and I'm excited to continue learning and researching for this project. I appreciate you giving me the space to do that.
It's an honor. So
you said we were going back, and I think for our listeners, they might be surprised at how far we're going to go back here. I wanted to start just by doing a quick broad stroke for anyone who maybe is listening and isn't super familiar with the history of parkour. Maybe they're not sure who Georges Hébert is and what his impact was on our sport. So kind of the traditional broad strokes narrative is you have a man named Georges Hébert. He is a Frenchman, early 20th century, late 19th century. He created this movement system called méthode naturelle, the natural method, which is probably what I'll call it, so we don't have to listen to me speak poor French for as much of the episode as possible. And once he had created this system, he started to popularize it. The French military, firefighters, and some other civil service brigades, I don't know, other civil
factions of the military.
Exactly. Yeah. Police, firefighters, the military, they all adopted this method to different extents and trained people in it. After kind of the end of the French Indochina War and their war in Algeria, they, as in the French military, started to move away from the natural method. A lot of Hébert's work was lost, but through a man named Raymond Bell and his son David and David's friends Sébastien Foucan, Jan Hunatra, William Chow, and the kind of core group that often is called the Yamakasi, the founders, that spirit and some of the movement from the natural method was adopted and tweaked to fit their use of an urban space in the late 20th century. So Georges Hébert, indirect role on parkour, but a pretty important role nonetheless, and it's where we get a lot of kind of foundational principles for the thought and philosophy behind the movement.
100%. Yeah, there's almost no further back you can go. There's maybe almost equally far back cultural phenomena to point to, but it gets really vague if you try to tie anything historically further back than this, and at least in terms of chronological events, right?
You follow the string back and you kind of get to Georges Hébert, and from I think a practical standpoint, that's where most people stop. And what we wanted to go into in today's episode are some of Hébert's influences. So if we keep kind of following that thread of movement, now we're no longer necessarily tracing something that directly leads to parkour, but we're talking about where Hébert got interested in movement. And for that, we're going to go way, way back to ancient Greece and talk about the development a little bit of gymnastics, because as maybe contentious as it is, right, gymnastics and parkour kind of are like branches on an evolutionary tree, right? They have a common ancestor here. And so we're kind of tracing it back to the common ancestor, which is not representative of modern parkour or modern gymnastics, but was an inspiration for a lot of the people that Hébert drew information from, and inspired both Hébert's method and the philosophy that he developed around his practice.
Yeah. So in some ways, it's like the prehistory of parkour.
The cave history of parkour.
It's like, it's the first mammal. The story of evolution up to, Homo sapiens includes, of course, an explanation of what it is to be a primate and a mammal and a reptile and a vertebrate, before that. And so we're kind of going into all that stuff. That's the foundation that eventually gets synthesized into something you can actually start to point to in terms of parkour. So very exciting.
Absolutely. And ancient gymnastics is really, really cool.
Yeah.
I think I didn't know a lot about it before doing some research for this program, and it is kind of shrouded in a lot of mystery. So the first record that a lot of people point to that may have been something related to what we now refer to as gymnastics, there were paintings in the island of Crete, Minoan paintings of people jumping over bulls. And these are in the range of like 25 to 35,000 years old, which is absolutely insane when you're talking about that. But that's really one of the first things we can look at people doing, kind of exploring movement, not just as a form of like functional hunting and gathering, or dance, as like a way of connecting spiritually, but as kind of a celebration of its own movement as its own entity, right? So that's what ancient gymnastics potentially arose out of.
Yeah, that's really important, is like we don't really know. Like we're still excavating as much detail as we can, but the archaeology on the real story and the source of movement itself and the celebration of it, like you're saying, it's not a crystal clear picture. No,
and I mean, it's like the Olympics are a perfect example of, we have record of actual Olympics that happened, but there's a lot of legend that goes into how the Olympics started and all these other stories. And we won't go into those legends necessarily, but what we do know about gymnastics in ancient Greece is really, really cool. I'm going to go back to like 500 BC to maybe 100 BC. That's where we start to kind of get reputable reports. A lot of these are from either Greek plays or dialogues. So Plato, obviously very, very important philosopher, one of the founders of Western thought, essentially. Plato had a background in gymnastics in the broad sense of kind of movement training. And when we talk about gymnastics in ancient Greece, it was this conglomerate of different practices. So, your gymnastics practice wasn't just acrobatics. It included like wrestling, it included boxing, running, track and field, and already for those who are familiar with Georges Hébert, there are like little bells going off probably. Like, that sounds quite familiar with where we're going to go 2,000 years in the future. But the other primary thing about ancient gymnastics, at least in ancient Greece, is it was not exclusively a movement practice. It was inherently tied into kind of foundational thoughts on what it meant to have virtue, to be a virtuous person. And a lot of thinkers, Plato and Socrates, from Plato's reports essentially of Socrates, we gather that those two in particular really thought of movement and this kind of cumulative approach to gymnastics as one of the three legs of being a righteous, virtuous person. And so it was great if you were a philosopher, but if your body wasn't active, you could only go so far. And there was this sense that the mind, the body, and the spirit were all intricately tangled up and intertwined. And the ancient Greek practice of gymnastics really embraced that idea, and the gymnastics practice areas and the palaestreia boxing halls, all of these physical spaces in ancient Greece were often, at least in the records that we have, sites for dialogue among people like Pythagoras and Plato and Socrates. So you have the great thinkers sitting around at the gym after their workout, and that's when a lot of these thinkers are having conversations about what would your republic look like, Plato, if you had one. And I just love that is really the shared common ancestor, if there is one, between parkour and modern gymnastics, is this question of what makes a virtuous person. And the ancient Greeks decide, well, it's, essentially strong mind, strong body, strong spirit. And no coincidence that is the translation of the Yamakasi name, which we'll get into a little bit later, but you've got pretty direct lineage right there.
Wow. Yeah, you can see how the flow of something becoming narrowed into a discipline always starts from almost a super generalization of all the big questions. And so you have to pull it all into a sort of bottleneck to even name something. And so parkour is, of course, going to draw from the most ancient, when you pull the thread all the way back, it just goes into what does it mean to be alive and a human, and just like it gets real deep.
How do I be strong? How do I be capable? And these were questions that the ancient Greeks were really interested in, and kind of the next step in our evolution of gymnastics, which is what we'll continue calling it at this time, is the ancient Romans, who were not quite as abstractly oriented as the Greeks. The Romans were a lot more practical, and they were concerned with the logistics of running the biggest empire that history had ever seen at that point. So when they saw the Spartans and the Athenians and the other Greek city-states practicing gymnastics, and the Spartans actually used forms of gymnastics to train their soldiers. So they at least had recognized that this broader sense of gymnastics was a great means of physical training. And obviously around the same time, you do have some form of the Olympic Games going, where different city-states are competing in different events, and the best athletes are coming together to strive together and compete and see who can bring home the glory to their city-state. But the Spartans had started to militarize it a little bit, and the Romans looked at them and said, well, that seems like what they're doing works pretty well. We're going to take a little bit of that. And so they started to implement pieces of Greek gymnastics training into their regiment. And they developed, for instance, a wooden saddle to have Roman soldiers practice mounting efficiently. And this is legitimately the origin of the pommel horse. I love that is a thing. It is called the pommel horse because it was used to practice mounting a horse.
It's perfectly clear now. It makes so much sense because it's a very odd thing otherwise.
Yeah, almost. It's like, why are people doing fancy horse mounting techniques? Well, that's where it came from. So the Romans were more utilitarian. They were not as interested in using these movement practices to exclusively explore what it meant to be strong or virtuous, these other kind of abstract ideas that the Greeks were interested in. And because of that, I think a lot of the value that got people motivated, maybe for lack of a better word, to engage with movement in gymnastics, it started to pigeonhole itself into military training. And within the Roman Empire, it kind of flourished in that little genre on its own, but you didn't see it expanding in the sense that, people didn't go to the Roman bathhouse after a workout and have the conversations in the same way that they would in ancient Greece, where you would have those conversations in the gymnasium or in the palaestria. So already, like you were saying, it goes from these kind of broad strokes, general questions. What does all of this mean to the Romans? Like, let's just make sure we can get off and on our horse and that we're physically fit enough to fight the barbarian invaders when they come for the homeland. And that's around 100 BC. Big changes happened right around the turn from BC to AD. And you have the kind of growth of Christianity, the Catholic Church in particular, and the interest in bodies and movement just plummets as Europe in particular enters what we call the Dark Ages. So questioning what value the body has. That is no longer a priority in any context, not even military, for a lot of Europeans from 300 to maybe 1400 AD. The focus is entirely on developing spirituality. And at this time, the general philosophical, I guess, gist is that the body just gets in the way of the development of the spirit. And that's when you have all of these ascetics and monks that are, developing techniques to distance themselves from their body. So this was not a time that gymnastics or any type of movement practice was thriving by any stretch of the imagination. And what we do kind of keep from that earlier period is preserved kind of in like traveling shows. So Roma, circus performers, essentially acrobats. There's also a strong acrobatic heritage that comes from China and from India. And these kind of mix in the Middle East and in Turkey, and they all sort of diffuse into what would really kind of become our circus culture. And so circus ends up preserving a lot of these ideas and becoming that fluid that is able to carry this through the Dark Ages, while most of Europe is focused on avoiding contact with the body and avoiding thinking about the body as much as possible. And we break out of that in probably about the 1500s. And so you've got the Renaissance. Folks are disengaging a little bit with religion, or at least changing the context in how they relate to religion, the body, spirituality. And the first person, and really the only person from that time period we're going to mention that directly contributes to Georges Hébert, is a man named Francois Rabelais. And he was a polymath kind of thinker. He was a writer, has written some pretty well-known pieces for anybody who's familiar with works from that time period. He was a comedian, essentially, through his work, kind of a satirist. Yep. And he's also amazingly interested in the human body. And this fascination comes through in his work, in his fiction, but he also started to think about how the human body performed and wrote a little bit about it in a non-fictitious way. And he was the first one to kind of differentiate categories of movement. And he split those human movement categories into walking, running, jumping, climbing, lifting, throwing, QM or quadrupedal movement, balance, swimming, and self-defense. And for anybody, again, who has a little bit of working knowledge of the natural method and Georges Hébert, those categories will sound very familiar. This is in the 1530s, I believe. So Rabelais was very ahead of his time. And he was one of the first that took the preserved heritage of gymnastics and movement and started to kind of reintegrate it into European society. And again, we're focusing on European society because that is where parkour developed, not because that's the only place that had a movement culture. For anyone who's listening, obviously there's a huge movement culture happening at the same time in India, other types of movement cultures happening in Japan and Korea and China. But for the sake of this podcast in parkour, what we're focusing on is that direct kind of lineage. So we've got Francois Rabelais in France, and he's now reintegrating this into that culture, bringing them out of that movement Dark Ages to re-engage with the body as a thing that is fundamental to being human and not as something to be ashamed of.
Yeah. Wow. Would you say, so like the way I kind of heard that in my head was sort of like, we had these mind, body, spirit pillars, these three pillars that are sort of an initial categorization of what we could focus on. And so we focused heavily for a while on the body. It seemed like, these gymnastics and militarization of some of these movements and moves that were coming out of the Olympic Games and other training programs. We'd sort of, at some point, I don't know if there's any reason that you can point to of why we felt we maybe had exhausted that or we wanted to dive into spirituality, but there was this huge expansion initially, and then there was a huge contraction on the body and movement, and instead spirituality expanded, oddly enough, in something called the Dark Ages. And then And then again, there's like it's a, I don't know if it's that third tier that's opening up in the 1500s, the mind, is that being addressed in your head, or is it both the body and the mind, or is there just a balance? And I think it's awesome to think about that sort of baton being passed, through the circus culture. Somehow we have to keep that thread alive. And it's interesting to me that these different sectors of humans carry at certain times that spirit, that lineage.
Yeah.
Even if it sort of changes hands and changes houses, like, a crown changes families in
For sure.
different, Game of Thrones or something.
Or in European history.
Yeah,
for
or in
hundreds
actual
of years.
history.
Yeah. In this exact
history.
time period we're talking about,
Yeah.
in fact.
Mm-hmm.
I think that the other interesting thing that you kind of touch on about the circus heritage is the main difference there is that movement was kind of relegated to a realm of performance.
Mm.
It was not seen as something that everybody could engage with. And I think for parkour practitioners, that will probably be very familiar. Circus folks back then, I imagine, would be able to relate pretty well to us hearing do a backflip or hardcore parkour every time we try to do anything that engages with our environment. Yeah. So they had movement and obviously they were training incredibly hard, and what they were doing was being performed for the highest level of aristocracy at the time. But their movement practice was fundamentally like spectacle. It wasn't something that connected those three pillars you were talking about. And I think as for the historical funnel that happened, it was literally the development of Christianity. So particularly in the early history of the Catholic Church, when you have a messianic figure, not to get too deep into the history of this, but when you have a messianic figure who is saying that, look within, the body, being wealthy, being strong, these aren't the ways to get to heaven. Be meek, be humble, love the Lord with all your heart. It's better to poke out your own eye than to look at a woman, have lust for somebody or see somebody with that look in your eye. When you have all of these kind of anti-body sentiments floating around, the move toward asceticism and restriction of bodily engagement with the world, I think, is a pretty natural move. And also there are other factors. I mean, Europe in general was not as sociopolitically evolved, you could say, as ancient Greece or ancient Rome were. It was a little bit more barbaric in a lot of ways. And not to mention the Middle East, which was really where culture in all of its essence was preserved through the Dark Ages and unto the Renaissance. And that expansion happens precisely because the Renaissance folks are moving away from they're starting to create what we now think of as humanism, where you're celebrating humanity as its own thing, not humanity exclusively in the context of how we relate to God or gods. And so that expansion happened precisely because people are exploring the sciences again and are exploring art and music. And you see the same thing in art. Art became exclusively religious in Europe for almost 1,000 years. And then suddenly you start to see art that is going back to Greek mythology happening in the Renaissance, where now you have paintings of the Medusa and these other things. That rediscovery during the Renaissance of the Greco-Roman tradition of humanism was incredibly important. That was the foundation that our Western modern societies are built on. The growth of movement, again, as a practice is intricately linked to that historical moment, for sure.
Cool.
Yeah.
So where do we go? Where does it go next? In terms of how it relates to Georges Hébert.
Yeah. So from Rabelais, there's a little bit of I don't want to say a die-off, but there's a bit of a plateau. Movement's cool. People are okay engaging with their bodies again, but not a ton is going on in terms of development until the 1780s or 90s. The next kind of big landmark moment is the late 1790s. We flash forward to kind of Germany, Prussia, and a man named Johann Gutsmuth publishes a book called Gymnastics for Youth. And he's starting to explore and revitalize this interest in ancient Greek gymnastics. And he separates gymnastics movement into two categories, natural and artificial gymnastics. And the natural just kind of emphasizes physical health, being outside, engaging with nature. The artificial emphasizes more aesthetics, and that's engaging with the artificial man-made obstacles like the pommel horse. Some of the other ones that were developed around this time, a little bit later, would be, I don't want to say uneven bars, but I think the parallel bars, rings were a thing at this time. So the artificial gymnastics focused a little bit less on the health and development of the individual and a little bit more on the development of the method and engagement with what had been created to promote that method. So Gutsmuth was really the first one to popularize this again in probably almost 2,000 years, which is pretty impressive. And then he had a kind of fellow countryman, Friedrich Jahn, who in the early 1800s, again, this is Germany, right after Napoleon had invaded and was lording it over the Germans. Friedrich Jahn continues Gutsmuth's work. He invents a couple more and kind of refines a couple more apparatus for gymnastics practice, and he opens a space called the Turnplatz and just kind of formalizes what gymnastics training can look like. Interestingly enough, Jan is kind of an interesting character. He was this ardent nationalist because he was coming from this time where Napoleon had just invaded and was trying to crush any sense of German identity. And so Jan saw gymnastics as a way to train passionate, active young men to become essentially German nationalists who, wanted to be strong for the motherland. And the darker side of that is that his methodology was kind of adopted by the Nazis 100 years later. Not so hot, obviously, but you can see where the ties of training young boys to be proto-nationalists and essentially fascists. That is not the greatest heritage from Jan's perspective.
Yeah.
But it is interesting that he, maybe in a different way, and obviously he wasn't a Nazi. He was 100 years before
a long time
this.
Before, but he had no control over that.
He took movement and kind of reapplied it to a broader context. And I think that's something that Jan did that Gutsmuth didn't do, that Rabelais didn't really do. It was, now let's use movement as a tool for social change, for social education in this context,
and weaving almost back all the way back into the Plato and Socrates era, where it's like, all right, this has to introduce a virtue now again, or it has to. We're reintroducing movement into a context where it matters as a piece of your entire human life and development. Exactly. Yeah, and Jan really is the first kind of historical character we see that does that, and that's a big move. And in terms of Hébert's heritage, the final one that we're going to touch on. And actually, we should maybe, on a quick aside, I won't go too much into detail. There were a few educators that were kind of concurrent with Jan and Gutsmuth who were changing the way that children were educated in general. So for the longest time, right, kids were looked at as these little adults, and you just treated them like little adults. And you educated them the same way that you would yourself. You just sat down and put them in front of a book or had them memorize things by rote. And right around this time, there were a couple educators, Pestalozzi being one of them, I believe in Switzerland, who were starting to look at children from a more modern developmental perspective. And they were looking at how to incorporate music and dance and art and movement into a broader, more what we would now call liberal education, so that they were learning in a well-rounded way. And that ties really directly also into that humanist thread straight from the Renaissance. So that is kind of happening concurrently.
Jan, I'm sure, was aware of some of those developments, picked up on them, used gymnastics in his own way to touch on that. And then the last piece of the puzzle that we're going to go into is a man named Francisco Amaro. And he was a Spaniard who moved to France and ended up working with the French military. He developed a method based on a lot of the same concepts that Rabelais had defined in the 1500s. And he actually wrote a book that had a natural method in its title. Mm-hmm. He worked with the French military, and this is only about 80 years before Georges Hébert assumed essentially the same title that Amaro held in the 1830s. So Hébert was eminently aware of Amaro's work. What Amaro had done at that time was basically change military drill, move it away from the regimented kind of parade style, more flashy, I guess, or showy form of drill, where the focus was just on coordinating people. It wasn't necessarily on let's make these people stronger or more capable as soldiers. It was just let's get them all to move really well together and listen to directions really well, which makes sense for the type of warfare at the time. He moved away from that a little bit and started experimenting with training them as athletes. He incorporated those 10 movement categories and the main difference between Amaro and what we'll find out with Hébert is Amaro stopped at the movement side. He didn't do what Jan had done where he started to kind of look at movement as something more. He was just kind of, I'm a coach. I am going to make these soldiers better at performing on the battlefield. And that was where the interest stopped. So Amaro started to kind of redefine how the French military was training its soldiers at the time. He broadened their movement capabilities, but he didn't go any farther than that. And that kind of sets the stage. Again, that was in the 1830s. That sets the stage for a young Georges Hébert who's growing up in that post-Amaro French military environment to come on as a late teen, early 20-somethings, and really do something really vital for not just the military, not just the people of France, but I think for how the world saw movement as a part of human growth and development.
Oh, yeah, baby. Awesome. Yeah. And that we'll get into in the next episode, it sounds like.
Yeah. And I know that we touched a little bit on kind of why this matters.
Yeah. I mean, because we're now going to open it up a little bit for some contextualization of all of that, I think, right?
Yeah.
And, I just think it's interesting pointing out, because without giving too much away for the next episode, it's, we have these figures that sort of consolidate, and the energy that, is being recycled here, in my eyes, is sort of recycled. Like we see it, in Plato's era being very broad, and it means a lot. It holds a huge wedge in what it means to be human. And then it kind of gets diluted. Then we have Rabelais that brings it back into the modern or contemporary lexicon, at least like taking more market share, you could say, or just like it's like making it relevant again, because it kind of got squashed and put on the shelf, or at least like very, set aside and made irrelevant. So it's gaining relevancy again, but then now it has to be updated. And so then we have someone like, I forget everyone's name because I'm not so...
Yeah, Friedrich Jan.
Jan, so making it, not just relevant, but recontextualizing it, drawing it back into like, why is it relevant? Instead of just making it like expanded into different movement categories, which again is important. But that whole cycle is sort of happening in my understanding of it, where they go microscopic on it and then someone draws it back to the macro. Yeah. And so it goes like, again, there's different...
It's like there's explorers and there's integrators.
Yeah.
Like exactly. The explorer has to go deep to get deeper than what's been done before. And they have to go all the way down that rabbit hole. And then you have these integrators who are able to dive in and then take a step back and contextualize it. And I do think that's something that we see happen time and time again.
Yeah.
And I think that's just kind of how human progress works in general, right?
100%.
Like if you look at Einstein's relativity, he was an explorer And he was unique in a sense because he was an explorer. He was fascinated with things like light and came up with these abstract ideas. What happens if I am moving at the speed of light and I shine a flashlight? And then all of a sudden he is able to take a step back and come to these insane conclusions about the nature of reality. And in the context of movement, I think that you see that. And this actually ties really, really nicely into what we wanted to talk about, which is that common ancestor between parkour and gymnastics. So if any of our listeners aren't familiar with the current FIG situation, I'm happy to talk about it. As of where it is right now, over the past 5 to 6 years, the Gymnastics Federation, FIG, essentially wanted to work within parkour, but not necessarily with the support of the parkour community, to make parkour a subdiscipline of gymnastics, partially due to COVID, partially due to some blowback within the parkour community. It was not included in the Tokyo Olympics or the Paris Olympics, but it does seem like gymnastics is continuing to pursue parkour as a subdiscipline and may look to get it added in 2028. They are still hosting events under the banner of FIG. It's not like they've stopped. And I don't imagine they'd be putting money into it if they didn't want parkour to be part of gymnastics. So that raises a very interesting question, which a lot of people in the parkour community have already addressed. And that is, what is the relationship between parkour and gymnastics? Looking at this history, you can see how a gymnastics federation could argue that parkour is a subdiscipline of gymnastics. But I think in the context of what gymnastics meant when they shared that common ethos and what gymnastics is now, we're talking about gymnastics now as pigeonholing itself incredibly down that explorer route of we're only doing these 6 things. I'm only going to do this one, I'm coming up with one routine. I'm going to do it for the next 8 years until it's perfect. I'm going to perform it once if I'm lucky, and then I'm done with that sport forever. It's not like you don't see 60-year-old gymnasts like still trying to progress. It's not a practice that, and it does engage somewhat. There is obviously recreational gymnastics. However, the type of gymnastics that FIG wants to associate with parkour does not engage the human body in a contextual framework the way that parkour does, where parkour's ethos, it is a fundamental part of parkour that it exists not just as a sport, but as a wider practice to incorporate into your growth and development.
Yeah, I love that, man. Yeah, it makes me think of the circus people again. In a way, gymnastics has kind of like, tell me if I'm wrong here, or if you see it differently, but I feel like they've put themselves in that circus category, like, in the dark ages, in a way, where they're like, oh, it's purely performative. It's really weirdly specific, and it's only at this elite level. And partially maybe why, a theory you could put out there is, there's like a sister relationship between all these dichotomies. So there is like this aesthetic version of parkour or movement, and then there's a utilitarian version, and they all branch out even more beyond that. So there's utility as a human, or utility militaristically, and all these things, and everything eventually has to get balanced out, because if it gets one-sided and too imbalanced in one direction, there's a call for something to call in to fill in that vacuum. And it feels like parkour has sort of been this answer in many of our lives as young individuals to balance that, not just that, or especially when parkour maybe started, was more utilitarian. That's like kind of the answer to like not having movement have a space in the
public conversation,
the public conversation of what it means to be human. Yeah, and just like it's certainly felt like that in my eyes. And I've seen it in our culture, very vividly across lots of, it means a lot to a lot of the practitioners, especially the ones who've been practicing for a decade or longer. This practice is about developing of themselves. It's not about competition, and it's not about showing off. And of course, there are already, with the speed of the internet age, things have been recycled, and we've seen offshoots of the complete opposite of that in parkour. Within parkour, we're getting now, a derivative version of it that is like, all right, here's the super performative version of this broadly more, utilitarian or broadly more broad, or just broadly more
broadly
more
generalized,
generalized, like, yeah. And so people have taken it now, and some people may be like, oh, they've bastardized it, but ultimately it's just there's just versions of it in every.
Yeah. Do you mind if I try and distill what you're saying a little
because
bit?
I'm just kind of, it's such a big concept for me. I'm kind of rambling around it, but it's I want to hear what your thoughts are.
I think what we're kind of saying is an important theme here that relates directly to parkour from that expansion and contraction. Every discipline or sport has two sides. It has this natural and artificial, like Gutsmuth pointed out.
Mm-hmm.
You have kind of maybe let's say more, we have a sports side and we have a culture side. That might be a decent way to put it. So parkour started almost exclusively on the culture side, in the sense that it was a practice that was developed with community culture, personal development in mind as the end goal. The sports side, the end goal is performance.
Mm-hmm.
And that can be measured in competition. It could be measured in just personal output, performance, as a form of personal development. Now you're measuring your Kong precision. You're not measuring how much you've grown as a person. So it doesn't necessarily even need to be competitive. It just needs to be more goal-oriented, maybe a little bit more quantifiable. And what I was trying to say, I guess the difference for me, obviously gymnastics has both of those as well.
Mm-hmm.
So my wife, Christine, did gymnastics for a long time. I did gymnastics until I was 10. It was incredibly important as a thing for me to engage with movement as a kid. I learned a lot from it, but I noticed that the deeper I got into it, the less it became about the culture side and the more it became about the sports side. And I think that modern gymnastics, as defined in the competitive sense by FIG in this particular scenario, almost is exclusively focused on the sports side, and the culture side isn't as much a part of the definition. And where I see parkour and gymnastics differentiating, to kind of sum this whole thing up from my perspective, is that ancient root that we all shared was a combination of both, but you couldn't deny that the culture side was an integral part of the definition of that practice. And I think parkour exists in that same space where you take away the culture side, you take away the ethos and the philosophy of parkour. And I think a lot of practitioners, majority I would argue, would look at that and say, that's not parkour anymore.
Mm-hmm.
That is part of the definition of the sport, is that it has to tie into something bigger than just performance. Not to say that the performance side doesn't exist. Obviously, sport parkour is a thing. It's really cool. It pushes the sport in an amazing direction. But even those athletes, I think most of them would acknowledge that the culture side is just as or more important to them than the performance side. And my TLDR rant being wrapped up, that is where, to me, that difference between gymnastics and parkour lies, and why it's important to know this history, so that when you have an entity like FIG that says, well, look at the history, parkour is just as much a part of gymnastics as it is its own entity. You'd say, well, maybe in some ways, but spiritually,
I mean, yeah,
we're maybe a more direct descendant.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. It's like, it's almost more like, well, you fucked it up, FIG. You bastardized what
they just didn't have the balance. They didn't have the balance on the other side.
Yeah.
We can say that. Yeah.
You could say that. And, I'm perfectly fine with, the ancestor, if we can take it back there. But that's not what you've made it out to be. And the contemporary version of what you have created as an organization is too rigid, too specific, and too biased in that sport competitive direction for it to really be a proper homage to the spirit that you're talking about.
And where does the growth come from that? And I think that's another important thing, is that is the way to become a vestigial limb, is to pigeonhole yourself so far down that path, because how do you reintegrate out of that? That level of depth? And the only way to reintegrate is to go back kind of up your evolutionary branch to the most common recent ancestor and take your own direction. And, I think parkour, maybe because it's younger in a lot of ways, right? We still have so much room for growth, and that is why, again, having a knowledge of the history is so important, because it allows each practitioner to decide how much they want to be an explorer and how much they want to be that integrator. Where do they want to dig deeper, and where do they want to bring new things in? You just had Rafe Kelly on your podcast. I love what he does with nature and with fighting and with play. I coached with Movement Creative for a long time. Their emphasis on play and play-based learning is a direction that I'm not really that interested in personally, but I love seeing how they take it back and reintegrate it and how their students carry that forward. Same thing with Rafe. You know, it's amazing to see when you can take something this broad and dig back and not keep going down that path, but say, okay, I've learned all these lessons. I've got some gold. Now let me bring that gold back down to town, you know, and spread it around a little bit.
Yeah. Yes, absolutely. Well, I think that pretty well wraps it up. I think we can get in now to the next episode. And I hope you guys join us if you have the time to just go ahead and keep listening and binge that, or
wait for
it to come out, because maybe you're right up on it and it hasn't come out yet.
Thanks to the OG listeners if you're one of them.
All right. Cheers.